Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Emmett webinar featuring international law expert Avi Bell discussing the international community's use of lawfare against Israel. As we listen to pro-Hamas protesters across the US, Europe, the Middle East, and beyond accuse Israel of genocide and crimes against humanity in its existential battle against Hamas, which will very likely expand to include Hezbollah in the north at some point in the near future, it seems Orwellian to watch world leaders and international organizations demonize Israel rather than the barbaric terrorists who committed the actual war crimes with every intent of committing a true genocide against Israel's Jewish population. We'll delve into the responses of the international courts with Professor Bell for what I know will be a very insightful and informative discussion. We always appreciate everyone's support for the work that we do here at Emmett. These are very perilous times, and our work is more important than ever. So please consider making a donation to Emmett or even sponsoring one of our webinars. As always, the webinar will be recorded and available for future viewing. If you have any questions you'd like to ask Professor Bell, please feel free to place them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try to get to as many as possible a bit later in the program. Please also do limit your submissions to brief questions only. I now want to give a brief introduction of Professor Avi Bell, who is an Israeli professor of law at the University of San Diego School of Law and at Bar-Ilan University's Faculty of Law. He received his BA and JD from the University of Chicago and his SJD from Harvard. He also interned in the office of Israeli Supreme Court Judge Michal Chesson. He frequently writes about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I urge you all to follow his important work. Welcome, Avi, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Before we get into the specifics of the various international legal proceedings against Israel, I think it would be helpful for you to explain to our audience the difference between the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, where they derive their power, their respective jurisdictions, the strength of their determinations, and the means of enforcement of any such determinations. For instance, not all members of the United Nations have signed the Rome Statute that provides the ICC with territorial jurisdiction, and that includes the US and Israel. So perhaps explain how the ICC is now claiming to have jurisdiction over Israel and its leaders as well.
Sure. In order to do that, actually, let me take a step back. We should understand something first about international law more generally, because international law is not like regular laws as we experience them in other situations. International law is basically those agreements between states that are supposed to be followed by states as agreements. And that what that means is they're not really law, they're more contracts. You know, if you have a rule that's agreed upon by this state, but not by that state, then it binds this state and not that state. And international law, besides being only agreements, consent, doesn't have the traditional bodies, the institutions that you see in other places like police, jails, courts of law, etc. It doesn't have a lawmaking function, it doesn't have an executive function, and it doesn't really have a judicial function. So the ICJ is an institution that was created about 100 years ago. It was originally a court of arbitration, sort of graduated into the UN court. Its name changed, the functions changed a little bit, but more or less today the ICJ is the UN court, and it sits in The Hague. The jurisdiction of the ICJ is established by consent, which means that the ICJ can only hear a contentious case, if all the parties in the case have agreed to the jurisdiction of the court. Now, parties can agree generally by writing in a document that they submit to the ICJ, or by a treaty that they agree to all cases that the ICJ will care to hear, or they can agree case by case, issue by issue. Now, one of the things that the ICJ has done in recent years is that it's tried to expand its jurisdiction by picking out clauses in treaties that give the ICJ jurisdiction to hear cases concerning those treaties. And then it claims, well, all the parties therefore have consented. So in the case that's currently pending, I guess we'll talk about in a bit, the South Africa versus Israel case, there the claim of jurisdiction of the ICJ is that since both South Africa and Israel are parties to the Genocide Convention, and the Genocide Convention gives the court jurisdiction over disputes in the interpretation and application of that treaty, they both consented to jurisdiction. So that's the ICJ. And again, just remember, it's like almost everything else in international law. It's not general jurisdiction. It's simply by consent. It's just they found this hook for consent. The International Criminal Court also sits in The Hague. It's a much later invention. It is roughly 20-something years old at this point. It's been functioning for about 22 years. And the ICC is a criminal court, which means instead of it being about disputes between states, there's a prosecutor that sits in The Hague next to the court and files charges against individuals. Because it's an international institution, it has only limited jurisdiction, and its jurisdiction is only supposed to be over crimes that are listed in the statute, something called the Rome Statute, right? This treaty that creates the court, and that are carried out by individuals who are nationals of state parties or on the territory of state parties. Now, Israel is not a state party to the Rome Statute. How then can the ICC possibly claim any jurisdiction over Israelis? And so this is something the ICC has cooked up over a number of years together with the PLO. They've cooked up jurisdiction over, quote, the state of Palestine. And because of that, they can claim that Israelis are committing crimes on the territory of the state of Palestine, and therefore the court has jurisdiction.
Thank you. It's a lot to take in, and we're going to talk about the state of Palestine also a little bit later in the program. But so back in January, your colleague Eugene Kontorovich called the hearings in The Hague, where the ICJ and the ICC are located, as you pointed out, quote, a judicial October 7th, a completely unjustified surprise attack. At the end of May, in response to the case that you referred to that was brought by South Africa accusing Israel of committing genocide, the ICJ issued a ruling ordering Israel to immediately halt its military operation in Rafah. There are so many problems with this that I'd like to hear you discuss, including the fact that while the court has jurisdiction over Israel, which we've discussed, it has no jurisdiction over Hamas. We don't hear any ridiculous orders emanating out of the court that impact the actual murderers and violators of international law committing human rights abuses. This was also the most recent of several orders by the ICJ that basically seem to be micromanaging Israel's handling of the war. So is Israel currently violating the court order by continuing its operations in Rafah? And what does all of this mean in the long run, since it's also, this order is more like a temporary injunction or restraining order, and the full investigation and conclusions on whether Israel is in fact committing genocide in Gaza won't be handed down for years?
So let me just begin. There's a lot there in that question. Let me unpack it bit by bit. And let me actually begin with something that's very unusual for me. I almost always agree with everything that Eugene says, but here I have to disagree. I don't think that there's anything surprising in this. This is not a surprise attack. What this is part of an ongoing attack, an ongoing perversion of justice in both the ICJ and the ICC against Israel. The ICJ, before the war began, before the Hamas invasion of Israel on October 7th, the ICJ already had two proceedings going on against Israel. One of them was an advisory opinion. It's not formally a case, but the General Assembly had asked the ICJ to rule that Israel's presence in any part of East Jerusalem or the West Bank or the Gaza Strip is unlawful according to international law, and there have to be various punishments imposed on Israel as a result. And of course, everyone understands that when the General Assembly asks for such an opinion, that's exactly what the ICJ is going to give. That was one of them. The other one that was pending before the ICJ, there's this ongoing case. It's asleep right now, but it'll be revived at some point whenever the ICJ finds it convenient. There's a case being brought by the PLO, calling itself the State of Palestine, against the United States for locating its embassy in the city of Jerusalem, in Israel's capital city. And it's basically a PLO argument that Israel has no claim to any of Jerusalem. So it's a preposterous case, but that doesn't make very much of a difference. And so those two cases were already there. The South Africans have now brought their case. There will be more cases. Okay, now there's actually already a fourth case. But yeah, there will be many, many more cases. The other thing is, the way you phrase the question, it sounds like you think that there's a good argument for the ICJ that it has jurisdiction over the case, and I'm less certain of that. Right, the ICJ's claim of jurisdiction, as I mentioned, is based on its interpretation of the Genocide Convention, that there is a genuine dispute between South Africa and Israel regarding the interpretation and application of the Genocide Convention. Now, there could be, because I think it's fairly clear that that Hamas is violating the Genocide Convention. Hamas leaders, Hamas fighters, Hamas individuals, Hamas terrorists, collaborators with Hamas are all violating the Genocide Convention to the degree that South Africa is rendering assistance willingly and knowingly to Hamas. There's something to talk about. But Israel hasn't made that claim in the ICJ, and it's unlikely to make that claim because the ICJ is not a forum that's willing to address wrongdoing against Jews. And so that's not going to happen. And so there's no genuine dispute about the Genocide Convention. And the court hasn't even gotten to the question of jurisdiction yet. All that we're looking in this preliminary jockeying is about whether there are going to be, as you called them, temporary restraining orders, these preliminary orders by the court before it even decides whether it has jurisdiction. There's a reasonable chance that the court would ultimately actually walk away and decide it doesn't have any jurisdiction. I think that's not the most likely outcome, right? I think that a more likely outcome is they get to the merits and decide that it can't be proved that Israel is committing a genocide. But finding that it doesn't have jurisdiction is a neater way of getting out of this without having to have a finding on actual genocide. So it's not implausible they'll do it. And all they're doing right now is playing South Africa / Hamas's game of creating some silly, I think, thoroughly implausible jurisdictional hook in order to issue orders. Now, there's a last thing that's worth pointing out here, which is let's not take this so seriously. This is not a question of, it's not a real temporary restraining order in the case, in the sense in which you would get it issued in a court in the United States, and then if you don't follow it, then there's the sheriff, and there are penalties, there are fines, there's jail, there's the like. There are no such institutions at the international level. The ICJ issues a lot of preliminary orders. More than half of them are disobeyed, and I'm not talking about more than half of them disobeyed by countries like Iran or Russia. Right? I'm talking about by countries like the United States. The United States has blown off more than its share of preliminary orders. Britain blows off orders. It just happens to be the case. The court issues them, even if it formally has jurisdiction, in some abstract theoretical sense. The reality is it has no way of enforcing its orders, and it's not the wisest course to think automatically because it said something, no matter how silly, that we have to follow it. And so its order in particular on Rafah, or Rafah, however you want to pronounce it, it's a little bit ambiguous, so one way you can read it is that Israel's ordered to stop all operations immediately, and the other one is that Israel only has to stop those operations that carry a threat of turning into genocide, which is purely hallucinatory. But either way, Israel would be foolish to even consider indicating that it's following along with these orders. I think that the best response would have been silence. I think that Israel's made a terrible mistake thus far by making movements as if it's trying to comply with preliminary orders, such as by reporting on itself about whether it's committing genocide. Of course, it's not. The whole exercise is simply a PR campaign on behalf of a genocidal terrorist organization. Israel should not be participating in any way. Instead of slicing and dicing the order to figure out exactly what it theoretically requires Israel to do. Israel should simply be treating it with the contempt it deserves.
I mean, I would agree with you, but I can't imagine the pressure that Israel's leadership feels with, the international community, whatever that is defined as. But the world is really siding with the barbarians, and it's not just Orwellian; it's evil. So the pressure must be tremendous. But so let's move on to the ICC for a second, because there's a difference, I think, correct me, from an enforcement standpoint between the orders that the ICJ might come down with and what the ICC does. So the ICC previously announced that it was prosecuting Bibi Netanyahu, democratically elected Prime Minister of Israel. And that was followed by an announcement that the prosecutor is seeking to obtain arrest warrants for Bibi and Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. According to Secretary Blinken, the court lacks the jurisdiction on the matter, but like most statements issued by this administration, I would consider them just words. Netanyahu is being accused of various war crimes, including intentionally attacking and starving civilians, extermination, murder. Given that we all know that Israel is not guilty of any of these crimes, and certainly not its leaders as well, what about, I mean, it seems to me that we're living in a world where the facts don't matter. And the chief prosecutor in this case also has referred to Hamas leadership as victims. So as I started this out, there's a difference with enforcement, because if there are arrest warrants issued for Israel's leaders, what does that mean internationally? Let you explain to our audience why that's a little bit more serious, I think, than what came out of the ICJ.
Well, I'm not overwhelmed by the seriousness of it either, but yeah, let's understand what the ICC can do. Okay, so the ICC, as I said, it's a criminal court. There's one prosecutor. He brings all the charges, and he charges individuals. And so the way the general process is that the prosecutor carries out a criminal investigation. It can be divided up into two: a preliminary investigation and a full-fledged investigation. And then when the prosecutor decides either to issue charges or not, then the prosecutor comes up with a draft arrest warrant, goes to the pretrial chamber of the court, and gets authorization to issue the arrest warrant, and then puts it out into the world. And in theory, all state parties to the Rome Statute are supposed to arrest that individual and turn him or her over to the ICC to stand trial. And if convicted, that person can be placed in jail. Now, in reality, it is basically impossible for the ICC to get its hands on anyone who doesn't want to be captured. And so I think that it's a certainty that the pretrial chamber will approve the arrest warrants against Netanyahu, Gallant, and any future Israelis that the prosecutor chooses to issue charges against. And I can guarantee you this is not the last. Right? There will be other preposterous charges against other Israelis. But I do believe that most Israelis, including Netanyahu and Gallant, are intelligent enough to understand that if they submit themselves to the court's jurisdiction, they will not get a fair trial. It will not even be according to any recognized legal standards. And what's more is that just the idea of the trial will be devastating to the state of Israel. It's basically a propaganda exercise on behalf of terrorists. So I don't think we have to worry about an actual trial taking place, or at least I hope that they're not. I have to say, I'm a little bit shocked that the legal advice that they're getting inside Israel from the Attorney General and others is, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this without it sounding too strong, but it's a little bit reckless and I think quite dangerous to the interests of the state of Israel. The Attorney General and staff appear to be trying to cook up arguments that can be used in a trial, such as complementarity, to get the defendants off the hook, as if there's a trial to be had. or there's a trial that will follow any recognized rules, and that would be the worst thing imaginable. I do hope that the government is not going to listen to the advice they're getting here, because it's truly horrible. And I'll also say that already we've gotten to this point in part because of cooperation between Israeli legal authorities and the ICC prosecutor, where Israeli legal authorities have been passing along documents and having discussions and inviting them to Israel in order to try to convince them of the merits of the Israeli case. And of course, the Israeli case here is impeccable. There's no solid grounds for criminal charges against any Israeli, besides the fact that there's no jurisdiction. The actual crimes that are named don't fit whatsoever any of the conduct that Israel has carried out. The legal theories here are insane, but that doesn't interest the prosecutor. And the absurdity has gotten to the point where at the moment that the prosecutor was holding his press conference announcing he was going to indict Netanyahu and Gallant for the crime of engaging in self-defense of the Jewish state, he was actually scheduled to be en route to Israel to meet with legal authorities in Israel who are trying to assist him. And it's mind-boggling. I just don't understand what on earth has possessed them to take this reckless course of action. But ultimately, Israel has control in the following sense: as long as Israel does not cooperate and does not turn any of these people over, does not allow any of them to be taken, this ends with the propaganda exercise that we've seen.
But Avi, if arrest warrants are actually issued, doesn't that restrict the ability of the subjects of those warrants to travel to countries that have participated or have signed on to the Rome Statute? And wouldn't they have a legal obligation then to arrest anybody that enters their country?
Again, in theory, a lot of things are true, but the history of the ICC and its arrest warrants is that it has issued arrest warrants for some real criminals, right? Criminals that actually have engaged in genocide or actually have engaged in mass war crimes and mass killings. And the arrest warrants have been out there, and then the leaders that were the accused then flew around the world and made sure that before they landed, they spoke with the country in question. So wrongdoers under indictment from the ICC landed in South Africa, for example, accused of genocide, and then were not turned over to the ICC, even though the South Africa is a party to the Rome Statute. There have been other states where they've gone, and what it really means is that any Israeli leader, before going to wherever it is, and I shouldn't say leader because it's not just going to be leaders. I think that ultimately the prosecutor has signaled his intention to go all the way down the chain, right, to the simplest soldier. So, but ultimately they have to be very careful wherever they travel. And I would say the caution should start now. It's not simply when the arrest warrants are issued. You can imagine a situation in which, in order to try to trap somebody junior, they'll keep the warrants under seal and then reveal them at the last moment when they want to try to catch somebody. So all Israelis, doing whatever, have to be cautious about international travels these days, because they may end up being the unwilling participants in a Dreyfus show trial.
Crazy. I mean, I also there was a 2013 essay that the ICC prosecutor, in which he wrote that the ICC is incapable of delivering justice. That's a direct quote. So it seems to me that, his recognition of the lack of the ability, I mean, due process is an American concept, but the lack of fairness in the ICC is just built in. So I want to talk about the ICC's decision. Okay, several years ago, it opened up an investigation into war crimes in Afghanistan that included the U.S. and its allies. And the Trump administration sanctioned not just the ICC officials involved with the investigation, but also imposed visa restrictions on the families of those officials. And it launched a counter investigation into the ICC for alleged corruption. Then Attorney General Bill Barr called those measures an important first step in holding the ICC accountable for exceeding its mandate and violating the sovereignty of the United States. And Barr went on, and he also addressed the ICC's separate investigation of Israel, stating that, this is a quote, given Israel's robust civilian and military legal system and strong track record of investigating and prosecuting wrongdoing by military personnel, it's clear that the ICC is only putting Israel in its crosshairs for naked political purposes. So along comes President Biden, and as was done with so much of Trump's national security policies, Biden reversed Trump's executive order imposing the ICC sanctions and terminating the visa restrictions. Blinken claimed that they were inappropriate and ineffective. So now fast forward to the ICC's announcement on these warrants for Bibi Galant and others. The House of Representatives responded with the passage of a bipartisan bill to sanction the ICC. 42 Democrats signed on. Biden has denounced the ICC action, but he also strongly opposes the legislation, which means that it's dead on arrival in the Senate. It'll never make it to his desk. So this is a long-winded way of me asking you, Avi, to please share your thoughts on what the U.S. could and should be doing to help Israel in the face of this international pressure, because it seems to me that Biden officials are not just turning on Israel, but they're also ignoring the fact that the U.S. could be the next on the ICC's prosecutors list. So what should the U.S. be doing, Avi?
So actually, let me again take a step back, say something more generally about the ICC, and then I'll zero in on measures by the United States. So the ICC has a pretty abysmal record of effectiveness, of lack of effectiveness. Right? It's been around for more than 20 years. It's gotten final convictions and punishments of about fewer than a dozen criminals. Right? It's just like basically once every 2 years, it gets somebody punished, not necessarily for the biggest or worst things. It's simply it hasn't gotten very much done, and the way it's functioned is it's basically functioned against politically weak states. Almost all of its convictions to date were against African defendants, and that was where the ICC was until fairly recently, and then the ICC. It begins with Israel, but you can see this in other places. The ICC started taking a turn towards trying to boost its importance by engaging in straight out politics. And so one of the things was it announced that it was going to launch an investigation into American soldiers for alleged wrongdoing in Afghanistan. It's taken a number of steps to issue. This is all now under the current prosecutor. It issued arrest warrants for Russian leaders. Now, the arrest warrants for Russian leaders may very well be deserving. I will say may very well because the actual indictments are sealed, and so I can't tell you exactly what's in there. And what's more is I've not been impressed by the professional quality of the work of the ICC prosecutor. So even against criminals, you may have a charge sheet that does not actually reflect any crimes. But what makes the charges against Putin and other Russians preposterous is everybody understands they are never going to show up for a trial. It's purely PR. Right, and it's the same thing for the indictments that the planned charge sheets against the three senior Hamas leaders. There's never going to be a trial. They're never going to show up, right? And so it's purely for political reasons. Now, when you see these purely political, these grandstanding charges that are, in the Israeli case, also meritless and without even a credible argument for jurisdiction, what you're essentially looking at is not only an attempt to pervert the international legal system to support terrorists and punish the victims of terrorists, you're also looking at threats to commit crimes, that taking somebody into custody without any legal authority and confining them is kidnapping, right? And the prosecutor has gone beyond that. The prosecutor doesn't like being criticized, and so he tweeted. The ICC prosecutor tweeted several weeks ago that anybody who tries to interfere in an investigation should be aware that he may use this authority under Article 70 in order to to grab them, try them, and put them in jail. Right? These, if an American senator dares to vote in favor of sanctions, says Karim Khan, he's going to put him in jail. Of course, Karim Khan's not going to put him in jail. It's just an attempt to engage in strong arming and extortion. But these are crimes. These are real crimes, and it's worth punishing the ICC prosecutors' staff for these crimes. Lesser steps than prosecuting them for the crime. Simply announcing personal sanctions on the prosecutor's staff was enough to get the prosecutor's staff to drop the charges against Americans regarding Afghanistan. I think that sanctions and other measures against the ICC prosecutor's office and against the ICC judges and their staff is absolutely the correct thing to do to defend the justice system against these perversions of justice, and is on very solid moral and legal grounds. And it's unfortunate that, as you said, it doesn't look like the Biden administration is going to stand up for the right thing here. That I could even say worse than that. If you look at the various measures that have been taken, the various charges that have been leveled by the ICC and by the ICJ so far, they pretty closely match the propaganda campaigns coming out of the White House. Don't go into Rafah. More humanitarian aid. Israel is not taking sufficient care to protect civilians. One for one, the lines that you're hearing out of the White House, and I think that's not coincidental. They're trying to step along a line where they're giving the Biden administration room to continue defending Hamas and throwing Israel and Israelis to the wolves. So sanctions are really, really important. Until January 20th, I think there's very likely not going to be American sanctions that are effective, and maybe not for 4 years after that, depending on how the elections come out. And that doesn't mean that this is the only thing that can be done. The United States is not the only actor. It's the most important actor, but other countries can be imposing sanctions against the ICC. It won't be as effective as if the United States does it, but Israel should certainly be considering it. Again, I don't understand why legal authorities in Israel are recommending such a soft and a course of appeasement. It would seem to me that more aggressive steps could and should be taken. And there are other allies for Israel within the Western world. There may be a Mexico its past government, we'll see what the next government's going to be like, was willing to take a Hamas side, but there's an Argentina that's willing to take Israel's side. And you go through the same thing in Europe. You just had elections where it's very clear there's a political shift in power, and it's really important to start getting those countries that are willing to step up on the right side of things to impose sanctions against the ICC.
When you talk about the way they're handling all of this, I do wonder how much is coming from pressure from the Biden administration, holding certain things over Israel's head. So it's hard to figure out, as you as an Israeli certainly would have more insight, but I do wonder what pressure the US is putting on Israel. So I want to discuss the legal status of a state of Palestine at the UN, as well as what it means that a number of countries have begun to recognize such a state. Palestine has been a non-member observer state at the UN since 2012, and its status was upgraded last month, granting it various additional rights. So can you share with us what those rights are and what that means from an international law perspective? I'm wondering if the recognition of a Palestinian state by various countries is simply symbolic, or does it have broader implications as well? And what does it also mean for the ICJ and the ICC's jurisdiction over, let's say, the PA? I mean, probably not Hamas, but does Israel have the ability to bring a legal case to the ICJ demanding the release of the hostages, for instance? So if you can sort of talk about all of that. And also, what I'm also wondering, does Israel have the ability to bring a case against UNRWA which we know is basically an arm of Hamas, and it's a UN entity, and it's certainly guilty of aiding and abetting Hamas terrorists in their murdering and kidnapping of civilians.
All right, let me start at the end of that. Does Israel have the ability to bring these cases? I think that's presuming something I would never presume. It's like asking the question whether a black family in Alabama 100 years ago would have the right to bring a tort suit against the participants in a lynch mob that killed their, father and husband. Well, in theory, yes, but why would you? Do you not understand how things are going to go? Right. So does Israel have the ability to try to cook up a case by which the ICJ has jurisdiction and then demand, the ICJ order the release of the hostages? Yeah, I could come up with a theory like that, but why? Right. I mean, the ICJ and the ICC are not new to this business. They've been doing this for decades. The ICJ issued an opinion about 20 years ago. It's called the Wall opinion, right, in which it ruled, among other things, that Israel has no right to self-defense against Palestinian terrorism, which is shocking, but that's the ICJ. It's not going to be any different now. If anything, it's going to be even more shocking and even more immoral. Israel does not have to seek and should not be seeking help from these institutions that are all too happy to join in the lynchings. Right? But here, let's take a step back. So as a matter of international law, is there a state of Palestine? Well, there's a well-known criteria in international law. In order to be a state, it's a question of fact. You have to have a territory, a population, a government, and the capacity to carry on foreign relations. This is the first article of the so-called Montevideo Convention on Inter-American Relations. And there are those who have said over the years that in addition to those four ingredients, you need to have recognition from other states. But I've never been aware of anyone who's claimed that recognition without any of the ingredients somehow makes you into a state. So the Palestinians clearly do not have the ingredients of a state. There is no state of Palestine according to international law. That said, this is a gambit of the Palestinians. It's not new to the Palestinians. Palestinians have been doing this for decades. Okay. And the PLO declared its, the Palestinian National Council, an affiliated body of the PLO, declared independence in 1988. It was recognized almost immediately by 100-something countries. You're seeing a few more these days, but you're not seeing this mass change. It has always been the case since the late 1980s, early 1990s, that a massive number, most states in the world, have recognized the state of Palestine, even though there is none according to international law. And the gambit of the PLO is designed for something. About a little bit more than 10 years ago, during the early days, the first Obama administration, the PLO was looking. Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PLO, was looking for acceptance as a member state into the United Nations. He laid it all out in an op-ed in the New York Times, which he explained that the purpose of seeking recognition of Palestinian statehood is in order to carry out diplomatic and legal warfare against Israel. Right? It's in order to back sanctions, in order to back diplomatic measures, and in order to back lawfare, and that's exactly what he's done. The particular status that they have right now, that the PLO has at the United Nations, was cooked up together between the PLO and the then prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. It was designed specifically in order for the prosecutor to come up with an excuse for future jurisdiction over the so-called state of Palestine. And so they followed his recommendation to the letter, because they'd of course helped draft that recommendation, and that's what you're seeing right now. It's looking at, I think, backwards to ask, what are the implications of the recognition or claim for statehood. It's an implementation of a strategy of lawfare and boycotting and divesting from and economic measures against Israel and diplomatic measures against Israel. And the recognition of the Palestinian state is supposed to give at least a rhetorical fig leaf to legal fig leaf to the measures that states are taking against Israel. So I don't look at this as question. There's no legal issue here per se. This is more of a strategy of coming up with a fig leaf for the measures that they want to take against Israel. And if you want to fight it, you have to consider about how to blunt those measures. And it may be that in some cases, the place at which to fight it is at the recognition of a so-called state of Palestine. But in a lot of other places, that's not the first measure that should be taken. It can be taken a lot before that.
So I want to ask you, Avi, if you can talk about perhaps how all of this international pressure is impacting Israel's conduct of the war. The pressure from the Biden administration in and of itself has been tremendous. Slow things down, ceasefire, humanitarian aid. And even holding back much needed weapons. But the UN and The Hague are where the courts are located, as we've just talked about. So do Israelis feel as if they're alone with the international, just the whole world seemingly uniting behind the terrorists and turning on Israel, pressuring Israel to not kill? And the reaction to the 4 hostages who were rescued 2 days ago from the international community is shocking. And there's a great clip that I've seen of newscasters from all over the world demonizing Israel because there were innocent Palestinian civilians who were killed, when we know that they're really, most of them probably were not innocent at all, and they were holding hostages in their apartment buildings. So where is the Israeli mindset on this? And are Israelis holding strong? Because when I was there, I got a very strong sense of unity and determination. That was in February. Has that changed at all?
So let me tell you a little story. I was giving a talk about this, not in Israel, to an academic audience, and there's a member of the audience is a German economist, really the most bookwormish person imaginable, fair-minded guy, doesn't really know very much. And he asked what I think is a very good economist question, which is, why did Hamas attack? What were they thinking they were going to gain? What was their cost-benefit analysis? Like, how did they think they were going to win this? And what I said, and I think it's correct, is that this is not seen by Hamas as a war that will destroy Israel in a day. It's seen as a battle within the larger war to destroy the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And a lot of the intended effects of the attack were psychological, to break the fighting spirit of the Jews and the Jewish state, and to lift the fighting spirit of those who are fighting the jihad against Israel, right? The mujahideen. And it's really interesting that in one sense, the Hamas intentions were completely foiled. That is, I do not think that they broke the fighting spirit of the Jews in Israel at all. Right? There is a fair sense of unity and commitment to the purpose of being victorious in order for the state to survive. And, there's always very loud politics going on in Israel, and they don't stop even for a second. They haven't stopped right now, and there's a lot of political maneuvering going on. But the bottom line of this is, I still think that there's a very high degree of motivation in Israel, of unity of purpose and motivation to fight the good fight in order to save the state and protect the people's families and neighbors. Right? And also, Hamas failed fairly miserably in the Middle East. And you do not see that all these other mujahideen spread around the Middle East, and various terrorist groups have jumped to join the fighting. The only ones that have jumped the fight into the fighting are those that have been ordered to do so by Iran. Right, so various terrorist proxies of Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi, terrorist groups in Iraq that are basically Iranian proxies, and that's it, right? But where has the strategy been extremely successful? And it's in the West, right? In the West, you are seeing that not only the mujahideen, the certain kinds of Muslims, Islamists in the Western world, it's also a lot of progressives that are fully committed to the jihad against the Jews. Maybe more out of ignorance than anything else, or a misplaced sense of identity and justice. But whatever it is, they've had success beyond their wildest dreams, and you're looking at this slow rot in Western institutions that has taken place over many years in the academic institutions, in legal institutions like the ICC and the ICJ, that have ripped apart what people would call once upon a time the liberal world order, which I think was always a myth and never existed, but it certainly doesn't exist anymore. Most of them are more committed to jihad against Jews than they are to the liberal order. And Israelis see this, we're definitely isolated. On the other hand, that's not where the game is. Everybody understands that everybody in Israel, or not everybody, but let's say a large majority of Israelis understand that there is and always has been anti-Semitism in the world. World opinion about Israel is generally negative and unfair and employs double standards and relies on anti-Semitic tropes. And there's no expectation of getting a fair shake. The real issue, the only real issue, is what the United States thinks. And it's the sometimes hostile attitude of the Biden administration has been devastating, because I think the Biden administration has been attempted to throw a couple of bones to the pro-Palestinian side of the Democratic Party and a couple of bones to the pro-Israel side of the Democratic Party. But the bottom line is, when you add up all the steps, then it's been great for Hamas. Right? So the United States put a lot of pressure on Israel to slow down the fighting, to give Hamas safe haven in various places in the Gaza Strip, to prevent Israel from engaging in any sort of, let's say, humanitarian evacuation of civilians in the Gaza Strip to outside of the Strip in order to carry out the necessary operations of blowing up the tunnels, for example. And that's great for Hamas. Right? Now, the United States may have this excuse that it's saving Palestinian civilians, though really what it's doing is dooming them to be human shields. Right? They've pushed for Israel to promise at the end of the war a Palestinian state, which is going to be perceived everywhere in the Middle East as a gigantic reward to Hamas for its barbarity. It's the surest way of ensuring that Hamas will remain the most powerful actor in the political scene among Palestinians for the next 3 decades at least, right? Because they will manage to have achieved something that others before them did not achieve with lesser barbarities, right? And so one after another, you look at these things, and Biden administration has taken steps on behalf of Hamas, and I think that it has slowed down the war. Right? It's very clear to Israelis that Israel has slowed down the fighting. It's pushed supplies into Hamas under the guise of so-called humanitarian supplies, but really what Israel is doing, it knows that these supplies are being stolen by Hamas, and yet it feels that it has to do it because of the Biden administration. The Biden administration took over in a very strong way the ransom negotiations over the hostages. And by consistently pressuring Israel and backing Hamas's demands, I think that the Biden administration has effectively killed any chance of a negotiated ransom deal, because the Hamas demands keep getting higher and higher And so, yeah, it's the U.S. administration has had a devastating effect on Israel's conduct of the war. I don't think that the rest of the world is really the player here.
Yeah, somebody actually asked in the questions whether the world is committing a war crime by delaying the course of the war in Gaza. I mean, you could actually accuse the Biden administration of war crimes, I suppose, for the pressure that it's putting on Israel to do things that are
Those
harm's
those are
way.
not really war. They're not really war crimes. It may be an immoral action. I think it is, but no, they're not war crimes.
Before, there's a number of good questions in the Q&A, but I wanted to ask you, Avi, if you could just touch on, now that Gantz has stepped down from the war cabinet, what are the implications of that on the current status of the war cabinet, the coalition government, and what do you see playing out within the coming weeks and months?
It's hard to say because things are still playing out. But the bottom line of it is there's a pretty stable majority for the current government, with or without Gantz. Gantz's party was there basically for an expression of unity to the world. And it turns out it was lost on almost everybody. If you read the media coming out of the United States, they would still refer to the unity government as the most right-wing government in Israel's history. You know, it's like Gantz's party wasn't there. And they would refer exclusively to Netanyahu when they wanted to say bad things, which is most of the time. And so it's not really clear that what it is that it accomplished. Gantz is much more amenable to American pressure. I think that's why the Biden administration prefers working with him over Netanyahu. And in a certain sense, the fact that Gantz is now out of the government, it may make the government smaller and in that sense more fragile, but it makes also the government more of a common mind, and perhaps more ready to pursue the war to a more rapid victory, more rapid than the Biden administration would like. But I think rapid here is what's absolutely necessary for Israel's sake.
So I'm just going to turn to the few questions that we have in the queue. Somebody asked, what is the true definition of genocide? Surely Israel doesn't meet the definition, but Hamas does, as they are trying to eliminate a people.
So genocide is a term that was created after World War II, you know, sort of retroactively try to make something in international criminal law that will match what the Nazis had just done, right? And the actual definition that ended up in the genocide treaty was not that. The actual one was like everything else that's produced in international negotiations. It was a compromise. In this case, the most important compromise was the compromise with the Soviet Union, which wanted it defined in a very peculiar fashion. Genocide does not mean mass killings. Genocide means any sort of killing or maiming or harming or other kinds of acts. They're conducted with the intent to destroy a people in whole or in part, right? So if you take somebody like Pol Pot, who killed 2 million Cambodians in the killing fields, but he wasn't doing this in order to wipe out Cambodians. He was doing this in order to wipe out the bourgeoisie, right? And so that's kosher according to the Genocide Convention. That's not genocide at all. And on the other hand, when a Hamas terrorist kills a Jew with the specific intent to wipe out the Jews, that's an act of genocide, right? Now, is it sensible that that's what the law is? I'm skeptical about that, but that is what the law is. So it's fairly clear that Hamas terrorists and Hezbollah terrorists are violating the Genocide Convention every time they carry out an attack. As for Israel, the way the charges, the way that you see them made, tells you already they're not serious, they're preposterous. So there's a risk that Israel may fall into genocide. You can't fall into genocide, right? It's not the whole way that genocide is defined is it has to do with what your state of mind is. It can't possibly be a mistake, right? And so if the war ends up taking the lives of 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, 60,000, 100,000 people, it's still not genocide, right? The limit on Israel's use of force in its war against Hamas is found in the laws of war, not the laws of genocide.
So that will take us to the next question, and I guess you could spend an hour probably answering this, but is Israel doing as much as it can to protect the non-combatants in Gaza? I mean, I think we know that.
There's as much as it can is a very, very difficult question to answer, because the thing that Israel could do more than it's already doing is simply surrender to Hamas, right? Give up the war, let Hamas continue. And then there would be, right, if Israel carried out no combat operations, no non-combatants would be killed in any combat operations, right? But that's not really the question that I think that's not really the question that's being asked. I mean, really the question is, is Israel complying by the moral and legal standards that we have in the West? They're basically from Christian moral theology, but fair enough. Is Israel complying by them in its combat operations? And I would say not only is Israel complying with them, Israel's being stricter with itself than maybe every NATO army. Right. At least, what I mean is every Western army that actually engages in combat operations is much more relaxed and less solicitous of the enemy's civilian lives than Israel is. Israel's bending over backwards in a quite challenging situation because Hamas, on the other hand, is quite reckless with all civilian lives. Right? It wants to kill and murder the Israelis, but it's perfectly happy using the Palestinian civilians as cannon fodder, as human shields. And so it has no regard for them whatsoever. And Israel is within that system trying to protect Palestinian civilians. So it's not only doing more than Western armies would do, it's doing more than the Palestinians themselves are doing to defend Palestinian civilian lives. If there's a moral flaw in Israel's approach, there's a cost to Israel's over solicitousness, and that is that the operation takes longer, the hostages are held for longer, more Israeli soldiers are killed. And so there are people that are innocent that are paying a price for Israel bending over backwards to protect Palestinian civilian lives. But can you make a case that Israel's not being careful enough, not protecting enough to Palestinian civilians? I think that's blood libel. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Our last question should be brief. Somebody asked, who funds the ICC?
It's donors, state donors, those who joined the Rome Statute. It's a complicated formula. It depends on their size and power and so on and so forth. The ICC is a quite expensive operation because it's got a gigantic bureaucracy that does very little. But it also means that they're quite vulnerable to cutoffs of funds. If state parties stopped handing over money to the ICC, that would wrap up the ICC operations quite quickly. And so it's a shame that so little of the Western leadership of the world has shown the courage to cut off funding. Now, this is this is not the UN, right? So the United States is not a party, so the United States is not in the position to do it on its own. It has to go around to, countries that are member states and ask them to cut off funds. This is a point of vulnerability for the ICC. I see that you're not moving around enough.
Avi, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you everybody for joining in. It's so informative. I always learn so much from you, Avi, and this is recorded, and I think everybody should share this far and wide to understand really what's going on. So I wish everybody a good afternoon. Avi, thank you a million again. Hope to talk to you soon.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.